So, I think most of us here today can agree that doing nothing is kind of nice. I think some of us call it relaxation, but I've got two small children, two very energetic boys under the age of 4. Doing nothing, unfortunately, is a bit of an alien concept for me. In fact, when I was invited to give this talk today, my first reaction was, I've got so much to do. I should try and get it all out of the way, so maybe I can do nothing when the holidays arrive. But what happens when we do nothing? Bear with me for 1 second. Actually, make that 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds of me standing here, doing nothing, around 5 people somewhere in the world were forced from their homes by war, persecution, climate change. A few years ago, I wrote a book about 5 such people, ordinary people whose lives were turned upside down by war, and they were forced to make that dangerous journey to Europe to seek sanctuary. You know, I thought that if I could show that these 5 refugees were in fact just ordinary people, people like you, people like me, then there would be more compassion, there would be more empathy, and things would get better. It hasn't really worked out that way, though. Today, it's not the language of compassion that we hear from so many of our leaders, but the opposite, the language of dehumanization, language which numbs the empathy, which fosters violence, which splits society. All over the world, politicians using this language of hate and fear are winning. And it's so easy to feel powerless in the face of it all, to feel like one person can't make a difference. But nobody is powerless. And with the right tools and understanding, each and every one of us can start fighting back against the hate. Now, in my many years reporting on the refugee crisis and then the rise in populism, nationalism, extremism, I've come across 2 different points of view about what's going on in the world today. I'm going to call these people ostriches and penguins. Now, the ostriches, yeah, that's right, they bury their heads in the sand. They can't bear to look at what's going on in the world. It's too depressing. They turn off the news, look away. The penguins, meanwhile, just like that hardy little bird that we all love that survives in a harsh environment, the penguins can see opportunity in today's difficult times. Without something to fight against, they argue, people get complacent and nothing changes. Those penguins, I think they might be onto something. Have a look at the US midterm elections back in November in 2018. We saw the first Muslim women elected to Congress, the first Native American congresswoman, the first openly gay governor. I wonder, without a certain Donald Trump in the White House, if we would have seen quite so many historic firsts. Speaking of history, I'd like to now step back in time for a moment to look at how we ended up where we are today. Because if we do want to fight those narratives of hate and fear, we need to understand how they work and why they work. The refugee crisis of 2015. This is when we first saw that hateful, that dehumanizing rhetoric move from the political fringes and back into mainstream political conversation. Why? There had been economic crisis. People had lost their faith in the existing political systems. Politicians were desperate to regain the narrative, and the refugees, well, they proved to be a perfect scapegoat. Suddenly, we had leaders talking about swarms of migrants. A columnist in the UK called them cockroaches. In the US, a Republican compared refugees to rabid dogs. Politicians had rediscovered the power of fear. So how are they using this fear? A few weeks before those US midterm elections I spoke about, Donald Trump started talking about an invasion of migrants. Hateful, fearful language aimed at making people feel afraid, aimed at making voters feel like he was the only one who could keep them safe. Another example closer to home. In Hungary, earlier this year, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, seeking re-election, referred to migrants as Muslim invaders who expose our daughters and womenfolk to danger. Lies, plain and simple, dehumanizing an entire segment of the population for political gain, to win more votes, to get more power. One woman in Hungary, she told me that her mother had spoken about converting to Islam. She was so afraid that if she didn't, she would be killed in this coming invasion she kept being told about. The fear is real, even when the threat is not. And that is what makes this rhetoric so difficult for us to challenge. But if we don't challenge it, what happens? When fear is stoked in society, hate flourishes, and no one is immune. Study after study has shown a link between dehumanizing language and violence. And hate crime is rising in societies around the world. I'd like to step back a little further in time now, to September 1941, the outskirts of Kiev in Ukraine. The occupying German forces have marched at least 34,000 Jewish women, their children, the sick and elderly, to the edge of Babi Yar ravine. They take them away in small groups, strip them naked, push them to the edge of the pits, and shoot them. The writer, Anatoly Kuznetsov, was there, and this is what he said. As long as our hearts and brains continue to work, we must not give in. We must not forget those cries. What new Babi Yars lie hidden in our future, just biding their time? And which of us alive today is perhaps already marked out for them? He was right, of course. There have been plenty more Babi Yars. Just as the Nazis referred to the Jews as vermin, so the Hutu leaders in Rwanda would refer to Tutsis as cockroaches. The Serb leaders to Bosnian Muslims as aliens. Our repeated promises of never again are repeatedly broken. And enough time passes, and we forget the potentially awful consequences of our actions. Now, I'm not saying we're headed towards another inevitable atrocity, and I'm certainly not saying any of the leaders, the politicians that I've spoken about today, want that to happen. They don't. But we need to remind ourselves of the absolute worst that can happen. We need to feel the horror of what happened in the past and use that horror to fight back, to have the courage to stand up and say when something is wrong. Now, I'd like to return, if I may, briefly to my ostriches and my penguins. I hope I've shown that there is danger in doing nothing. But there is danger in the other path too. When we live in extreme times, the temptation is to be extreme too, to fight hate with hate, to treat those who disagree with us as the enemy. Do you know why it's so easy for politicians to exploit fear? Because fundamentally, we all want the same things, to keep ourselves and those we love safe. Let me tell you a very brief story about a woman in my book. Her name is Sina, and she's from Eritrea. She traveled all the way from Greece to Sweden by herself with her 3-month-old baby, Anthony, strapped to her chest in a baby carrier. She told me that hardly anyone helped her. In fact, lying in a ditch on the Hungarian border, her fellow refugees tried to convince her to drug her tiny baby so he wouldn't cry and attract the attention of the border guards. But Sina understood. It wasn't that they were bad people. It's just that in extreme circumstances, their priorities were their families and their children. And we need to return to this understanding of other people's motives, which Sina had, a return to empathy. Because frankly, nothing else seems to be working. But this brings us to the slightly tricky bit, the what exactly can you do bit. I read a lot about this because, I want to know what I can do too. And this is often where it gets a bit vague. There's a few broad goals and usually the word grassroots in there somewhere, and I never really know what that means. So I've come up with 4 very practical things which you can do which can make a difference. Number 1, vote, but don't vote for politicians exploiting the language of hate and fear. Number 2, find the politician in your area who best represents your worldview. Get on the phone and find out what you can do to help. Number 3, volunteer. What skills and expertise do you have that can help bring people together and foster understanding in your local community? Perhaps there is an initiative which helps get young people registered to vote for the first time. If you don't have time, donate to these kind of initiatives. Now, I'm aware that a lot of those points require time and/or money. But my last point requires neither. And in a way, it's the most important. Don't be silent. Engage with other people. And that doesn't mean shouting down anybody who holds a different viewpoint, but listening, reacting, understanding. The holidays are coming up. We see old friends, family. Talk about what's going on in the world, what we can do to make a difference. If you do hear the language of hate, challenge it. But challenge it with history, with empathy, with emotion. Most importantly, with emotion. That is what we see working. Real emotion. My book. So, it got some good reviews, but it didn't exactly set any bestseller lists on fire. But a couple of people came up to me afterwards and said, "Now I see that refugees are humans too." A couple of people. That's enough for me. With passion and conviction, anything you do will make a difference, and you don't need to change the world. Just one person's mind would be enough. And trust me, I know how easy it is to say, but I really don't have much time. And you would be absolutely right. we really don't have much time. Thank you.